Alright, welcome back. So, we've got instructions on what to do. They're telling us that we're going to have specific variables. They're not specifying the names, just the data types. So we're going to have a float. We're going to have to come up with, let's come down and look at what the output should look like, and then we'll go from there. 3 lines of inputs. All right. 3 lines of input. So we're going to get the height. We're going to get the bounciness. And we're going to, let's call it the bounces, the number of times the ball's allowed to continue bouncing. Now, there's some tips and tricks that I want to give you relative to how we interact with MindTap. Let's start out with our code block. Request the inputs. I want you to get familiar with breaking your code up into small, manageable blocks of code that are specific to tasks being performed. It helps us in debugging, helps us in explaining to others what we're doing, it helps us track our logic as we're going through things. Think of it as step by step. First thing we're going to do is request the inputs. We're also going to compute the results. And what we do in the previous ones, let's go ahead and display the results. All right. So with that said, I want to do this request the inputs. So let's say we're going to come up with height. Height was the first one we had to define. Let's say input, and I'm going to put double quotes in there. I want to grab this code right here along with that little space, and I copied it. And if I paste it in here, I have no spelling errors. I have everything exactly the way they expected it. Do that and it'll save you a little bit of aggravation down the road because you're sure that this is written the way they expect. Another time to do this is when you're using variable names. If the IDE that you're dealing with does not automatically give you the option and say, hey, is it height you're looking for? You click it and it auto-populate. To be safe, I would copy it and paste it in where needed to make sure that I didn't transpose the E and the I or leave out an H. We all make spelling errors here and there. The only thing I'm missing on this is typecasting to a float. Make sure that I've got a closing for every opening. So the float function has an opening and closing parentheses for me to be able to pass it something. The input has an opening and closing parentheses to allow me to pass something to that function. This one returns the value where we called it. Float will then return the value once it's done doing its work where we called it, and that would boil down to height equals the result of that float function. That's it. So what else did we have to do? Well, we had to do the same thing pretty much for bounciness. Let's go ahead and type that in, and one more input is the number of bounces. So we can go through, copy it, paste it, and do pretty much the same thing that we just done on the previous lines. So here's our inputs. We need to do a calculation, but for calculation, this calculation is essentially saying we're going to do a loop. And the loop is for the number of times bounces is our range for the loop. So we're going to define a for loop for each pass. I can call this whatever I want, but each pass is every time this thing bounces. For each pass in range bounces. So essentially this is saying how many items are in bounces. How many bounces are in, how many times did it bounce? So if I input 10, this is going to do whatever's in this loop 10 times. If I input in bounces 25, the range for bounces is 25. Remember, in computing we go from 0, I start at 0, so 25 bounces will be 0 to 24. And it's going to look at each item in there. So the first time each pass would be 0, second is 1, 2. We don't actually use this value that is place held in or temporarily put in each pass. We just do calculations. We increment the distance by height. We perform another calculation here, and we perform another calculation here. Excuse me. So we're going through this loop. Boom, 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 each time. The only thing we've got left to do is calculate the total distance that this ball has traveled in all of its bounces. So print, come down and space it, give that new line that they were looking for. So the \n is this new line, space between the inputs and the output. That string that they gave us, distance, whatever's been stored in distance at the end of that loop, comma, another string. So there's a string that includes a new line character, followed by distance, then units. Now, think back to the last video, we had concatenation going on in there. And I had to put a space in here because when we concatenated, those train cars came right up next to each other. And there's no space in between them. They connected directly. With this one, by putting that comma, it inserts a little space in between. It'll insert a little space in between. And we look here, you see it. So if I go ahead and run this, ball is dropped 3, 1, and what was the last value? 3. Now it's saying it's got a problem with one of my lines. Distance is not defined. On line 10. So I didn't have distance declared in here. I used it before I declared it. So let's come back up to the top. And right here on line 7, when I'm doing my inputs, I'm going to declare a variable distance and initialize it at 0. So I couldn't directly declare it and use it the way that I used it here. I needed to initialize it, give it some value beforehand. So essentially I'm saying here, distance equals distance plus height. What they did was said, wait a minute, how can I add distance to height if you didn't even give me anything in distance? All right, so let's go ahead and do it again. And our values were 3, 1, and 3. There we go, 18 units. So it looks like everything's good. I think I'm good. I think I did everything they wanted here. Following the logic, the algorithm, built it on out step by step. I think the output is the way they want it to be. Let's come over and look to test, see if the system found what it wants. It tested 3 different values as inputs, and they all matched up, one right after the other. So we're all good. Had there been an issue, I can come in here and look to see what was wrong. What was it? Then I can go back and debug my code, see logic error, syntax error, what was the problem? Okay. So that's it for this third one. See you in the next one.